The following is a fictional psychological crime story created for cinematic storytelling and dramatic entertainment. For 26 years, my husband brought me a cup of chamomile tea every single night. He did it the way another man might bring his wife flowers on a birthday, or remember an anniversary without being reminded. It was his small ritual, the one thing he had done from the very first week of our marriage in the summer of 1998, back when we were living in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in a small Midwestern town, and we did not own a kettle, and he heated the water in a saucepan on a stove with one working burner. He would stir the honey in 3 times. Never 2, never 4. He would set the cup on a coaster beside my reading chair, kiss the top of my head, and say the same 6 words. "Drink it while it's hot, sweetheart." For 26 years, that was love. For the last 90 nights, it was something else entirely. My name is Margaret Whitfield. Most people call me Maggie. I was 52 years old, a registered nurse at a regional hospital outside the city, mother of 3 grown children, lifelong member of a small Methodist church on a quiet street in our community, when I figured out that the man who had walked me down the aisle in June of 1998, the man who had held my hand through the births of all 3 of our children and the funerals of both of my parents, the man who had built me a swing on the back porch the summer I turned 40 because I once mentioned, in passing, that my grandmother used to have one, that man had been quietly, patiently, lovingly trying to end my life for the better part of a year. He was not a violent man. He never raised his voice. He never raised his hand. He was a pharmacist. His name was Daniel. He had worked at a local pharmacy on the east side of town for 22 years. He was a deacon at our church. He coached our son Michael's Little League team in 2011 and 2012, and a regional newspaper once ran a photograph of him on page 2, smiling in a red windbreaker, the caption underneath calling him a pillar of the community. He was the kind of husband other women would put a hand on my arm at potlucks and say, "Maggie, you got one of the good ones." And every single night, sometime between 9 and 10 in the evening, he was lacing my chamomile tea with a colorless, nearly tasteless sedative that he had been stealing 1 milliliter at a time from his own pharmacy for almost 2 years. He had a plan. He had a timeline. He had a $2 million life insurance policy with my name on it that I had never seen, never signed, never agreed to. What he did not have, what he never once accounted for in the entire careful architecture of what he was doing to me, was a wife who, on the night of the 3rd of June of last year, decided not to drink her tea. The cup he handed me that night was the same blue porcelain cup I had bought for him on our 5th anniversary, in a small ceramics shop on a back street downtown, the spring our daughter Hannah turned 3. There was a chip on the rim of that cup. A small one, no bigger than the head of a pencil eraser, on the side opposite the handle. I had dropped the cup in the sink in 2004 while I was rinsing it, and the chip had been there ever since. Daniel always turned that chip away from me when he handed me the cup, so I would not be reminded of the flaw. He thought it was a kindness. For 26 years, I thought it was a kindness too. On the night of the 3rd of June, I realized it was something else. It was a man who needed me to drink from the right side of the cup, because he had stirred something into the left. I want to tell you something now, because I think it matters before we go any further. I did not call the police. I did not pack a suitcase and drive to my sister Diane's house in another state. I did not confront him. I did not cry myself to sleep. I did not pray for God to change his heart. I have heard, in the months since this story took shape, every version of what I would have done if I were her. I have read the comments. I have read the letters. And I understand the question, because for a long time I asked it of myself. Why didn't I just leave? The answer is the same answer that every woman over 50 who has been married for more than 20 years already knows in her bones, even if she has never said it out loud. I did not leave because I knew, the way a wife knows things about her husband, that one phone call would not be enough. He was too careful. Too respected. Too good at being the man everyone thought he was. I knew that if I went to the county sheriff's office at 9:30 at night, in my nightgown and a winter coat, holding a single cup of cold tea, the deputy at the desk would look at me with kind, tired eyes, and ask me if I had been drinking, and if I had a history of anxiety, and whether my husband knew where I was right now. I knew that Daniel had a clean record going back to the year he was born. I knew that he had a pharmacy degree from a respected school in Ohio, a $40,000 luxury sedan in the driveway, and the home phone numbers of 2 members of the city council saved in his cell. I knew that if I left him on a Tuesday, I would be back home by Friday. He would adjust the dose. And I would not see Christmas. So I did not leave. I did something else. I did not poison him back. I did not retaliate. I did not become the thing he was. I want you to understand that, because it matters more than anything else I will tell you tonight. I did not want revenge. Revenge would have made me careless. I wanted proof. Proof was slower. Proof was quieter. Proof was the only thing Daniel could not charm his way out of. I went down to the basement that night, after he had fallen asleep, and I pulled an empty mason jar off the shelf where I kept the strawberry preserves I had canned the previous August. I carried it upstairs. I poured every drop of the tea he had made me into that jar. I screwed the lid on tight. I wrote the date on a piece of masking tape and stuck it to the side, in my own handwriting, and I hid the jar behind the bag of flour in the bottom cabinet where Daniel never looked, because Daniel had not opened a bottom cabinet in our kitchen since the day we moved in. And then I sat at the kitchen table, in the dark, in a house that had been my home for 16 years, and I made a list of every single thing I would need to do over the next 90 days to put my husband in prison for the rest of his natural life. There is a moment in every woman's life, and I do not care if you are 25 or 75, when you stop being the woman the world has told you to be, and you become the woman you actually are. For some women, that moment comes when they have their first child. For some, it comes when they bury a parent. For me, it came on a Tuesday in June, at 9:15 in the evening, when I poured a cup of chamomile tea into a glass jar and labeled it, in my own handwriting, with the date. I did not know yet about the $2 million life insurance policy he had taken out on me with a signature I had never written. I did not know yet about the woman named Brittany, 34 years old, a dental hygienist, who had been meeting my husband at a roadside hotel off the turnpike for almost 2 years. I did not know yet about Linda. Linda was Daniel's first wife. She died in October of 2007, 3 years before he met me, of what the medical examiner at the time called sudden cardiac failure. She was 45 years old. There was no autopsy. There were no questions. There was a funeral on a Tuesday afternoon in a small chapel outside the city, and a grieving widower in a black suit, and a life insurance check for $1.2 million that cleared the following month. Linda had a sister. Her name was Carol. Carol had spent 18 years believing what every woman believes when the police tell her there is nothing to investigate, that she was imagining things, that grief was making her paranoid, that her sister's husband was a good man having a hard year. Carol had given up. And then, on a Wednesday morning in July, a woman she had never met walked into a roadside restaurant off Interstate 71, slid into the booth across from her, ordered a cup of coffee, and said, "My name is Maggie Whitfield. I am married to the man who killed your sister. And I am going to need your help to prove it." There were 91 nights between the night I first poured that tea into a mason jar and the morning I walked into the county sheriff's office with a cardboard banker's box, a leather-bound notebook, 87 sealed glass jars of evidence, 3 private lab reports, a forged insurance policy, a photograph of a parking lot taken from across the street, and the sworn testimony of a woman named Carol who had been waiting 18 years for someone to believe her. The detective who took my statement, a man named Frank Hollister, 27 years on the force, 2 divorces of his own and a daughter at the state university, would later tell a reporter from a regional newspaper that in all his years of police work, he had never seen a victim build a case the way I built mine. He said most prosecutors could not have done what I did. He said his own detectives could not have done what I did. He said the only reason I had been able to do it was because I had something no investigator on earth had access to. I had been married to Daniel Whitfield for 26 years. I knew where he hid things. I knew the exact small tell at the corner of his mouth when he was about to say something he had rehearsed in the bathroom mirror. And I knew, on the night I poured that first cup of tea into a glass jar, that I was no longer his wife. I was the only person who knew what kind of man Daniel Whitfield really was, and I had 90 nights to prove it. What you are about to hear is the story of what happened in the kitchen of a colonial house on a quiet street between the 3rd of June and the 2nd of September of last year. It is the story of a husband who thought he was the only one in his marriage with a secret. It is the story of a first wife buried for 18 years in a cemetery outside the city whose name almost no one alive still spoke. It is the story of a sister named Carol who never stopped asking the question the police told her to stop asking. And it is the story of the 91 nights I sat across the kitchen table from the man I had married, and smiled at him, and watched the man who had been quietly, patiently trying to kill me become, one cup at a time, the architect of his own undoing. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It started in February. I want to be precise about this, because for a long time afterward, after the trial, after the verdict, after the night the prosecutor called me at home and told me the sentencing was finalized, I went back through my own calendar, the small leather one I kept on the kitchen counter beside the fruit bowl, and I tried to find the exact day my body first noticed something was wrong. February the 14th. Valentine's Day. Daniel had brought home a dozen red roses, the long-stemmed kind from the florist downtown, and a card that said, "To my wife of 25 years and counting." He had made dinner. Salmon, the way I liked it, with lemon and capers. And that night, after the dishes were done and the porch light was on, he had brought me my tea, the way he always did, and I had fallen asleep in my reading chair at 8:45. I never fell asleep in my reading chair. I had been a registered nurse for 30 years. I worked 12-hour shifts. I did not fall asleep at 8:45 in the evening unless I had the flu, and I did not have the flu. I woke up at 3 in the morning. The lamp was still on. My book was open on my lap to a page I did not remember reading. My mouth was dry. My heart was beating against my ribs the way a bird beats against a window. I could hear Daniel snoring softly in the bedroom upstairs, and I sat in that chair for almost an hour, listening to the sound of my own pulse, and I thought, Maggie, you are getting older. You are 52 years old. Your body is changing. This is what it looks like. I went upstairs. I lay down beside my husband of almost 26 years. I did not sleep again until the alarm went off at 6. By the end of February, I was waking up at 3 in the morning 4 nights out of 7. By the middle of March, it was every night. I would lie in the dark with my heart pounding and my mouth so dry I could not swallow, and I would count the minutes on the digital clock until it was an acceptable hour to get up and pour myself a glass of water. By April, I was starting to forget things. Small things at first. I would walk into the pantry and stand in the doorway and not remember what I had come in for. I would put a load of laundry in the washing machine and forget to add the detergent. I would call my daughter Hannah at her apartment and forget, halfway through the call, what I had called her about. Hannah noticed first. "Mom," she said one Sunday afternoon, "are you sleeping okay? You sound tired." I told her I was fine. I told her I was just busy at the hospital. I told her not to worry. I was lying, and she knew it, and I knew she knew it, and neither one of us said anything more about it. In May, I fell. Twice. The first time, I was carrying a basket of laundry up from the basement, and on the third step from the top, my left leg simply did not do what I told it to do. I went down hard. I cracked my elbow against the railing and dropped the basket. Daniel heard the noise from the kitchen and came running. He was so kind to me that night. He helped me up. He sat me on the couch and put a bag of frozen peas on my elbow and made me a cup of tea. He held the cup for me while I drank it because my hands were shaking too hard to hold it myself. 3 days later, I fell again. This time in the parking lot at the grocery store across town. I caught myself on the side of my car, but I scraped my knee badly enough that I needed 3 stitches at the urgent care. The doctor there, a young man with kind eyes who did not look much older than my own son, asked me if I had been drinking. I had not been drinking. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. I told him no. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he wrote me a prescription for an anti-anxiety medication I did not need, and he sent me home. My own doctor at the hospital, Dr. Patel, ran every test he could think of in the month of May. He drew blood 4 times. He sent me for a CT scan of my brain. He sent me for an MRI. He sent me to a neurologist, and the neurologist sent me to a sleep specialist, and the sleep specialist sent me to an endocrinologist who took one look at my chart and told me, kindly, that he did not think there was anything wrong with my endocrine system, but that he would be happy to refer me to a psychiatrist if I felt I needed to talk to someone. Every single test came back clean. Beautifully unremarkable, was the exact phrase Dr. Patel used the last time I saw him in his office, sitting on the edge of the examining table in a paper gown. Beautifully unremarkable, Maggie. I do not know what to tell you. Sometimes the body just does this. Sometimes a woman your age, with your stress level, with everything you have on your plate, just needs a little rest. I did not need a little rest. I had been a registered nurse for 30 years. I had worked the cardiac floor at the regional hospital since 1996. I had taken care of men and women who came into our hospital with symptoms exactly like mine. The waking up at 3 in the morning. The dry mouth. The unsteady gait. The cognitive fog. I knew what those symptoms looked like. I had charted them, hundreds of times, on hundreds of patients, and I knew what they meant. They meant that someone was being given a benzodiazepine. They meant that someone, somewhere in that patient's life, was either prescribing them too much, or feeding them something they did not know they were taking. But I did not let myself think about that. I did not let myself think about it for a long time. Because to think it was to admit that the person who handed me my tea every night, the person whose ring I had worn on my finger for almost 26 years, the father of my 3 children, was the kind of man who would do such a thing. Then, on the evening of the 2nd of June, my husband made one mistake. He stirred the honey 4 times. Not 3. 4. I sat in my reading chair, with my book open on my lap, and I watched him do it. I watched him stir the honey 4 times into my chamomile tea, and I watched him stop, and I watched his face change for a fraction of a second, the way a man's face changes when he realizes he has broken a habit that nobody else was supposed to notice. He looked at me. He smiled. He carried the cup over, kissed me on the top of the head, and said the same 6 words he had said every night for 26 years. Drink it while it's hot, sweetheart. And I held that cup in my hands, and I felt the warmth of it through the porcelain, and I knew, the way you know a thing you have known for a long time without letting yourself know it, that my husband was trying to kill me. I want you to understand what it feels like to sit across from a man you have loved for 26 years and realize, in the space of a single breath, that he is the one who has been doing this to you. It does not feel the way it feels in movies. There is no music. There is no dramatic close-up of your own face going pale in a mirror. There is no rushing of blood in your ears. There is, instead, a great and terrible quiet. A quiet that settles over your kitchen, over your reading chair, over the cup in your hands, and over the rest of your life, all at the same time. I held that cup of tea on the 2nd of June, and I felt that quiet settle over me, and I made the most important decision I have ever made in my life. I decided to pretend I had not noticed. I drank a sip. Just a sip. Just enough to wet my lips and make a swallowing sound that he could hear from across the room. And then I turned a page of my book, the same page I had been on for the last 20 minutes, and I said, "This is wonderful, honey, thank you." He smiled. He kissed the top of my head again. He went upstairs to brush his teeth. And the moment I heard the bathroom door close behind him, I stood up, and I walked into the kitchen, and I did something I would do, with small variations, almost every night for the next 90 nights. I opened the cabinet beneath the sink, and I pulled out a clean mason jar I had hidden behind the cleaning supplies. I set the jar inside the basin of the sink so that no spill would touch the counter and leave a residue Daniel might notice in the morning. I poured the tea carefully into the jar, watching the warm amber liquid fill the glass to within an inch of the rim. I sealed the lid tight. I labeled the date on a piece of masking tape in my own handwriting, and I stuck the label to the side of the jar. I rinsed the chipped blue cup. I dried it with a clean dish towel. I returned it to the cabinet where it lived. I hid the sealed jar back beneath the sink, behind the cleaning supplies, where Daniel would never look. I was not fighting him with poison. I was surviving him with evidence. I went to bed beside my husband, and I lay there in the dark with my eyes wide open, and I did not sleep until almost 5 in the morning. But I did not have a headache when I woke up. I did not have a dry mouth. I did not have a thudding heart. I had, for the first time in 4 months, a clear head. And in that clear head, I began to make a plan. The next morning, the 3rd of June, I called in sick to the hospital for the first time in 6 years. I waited until Daniel had left for work. I waited until his luxury sedan had pulled out of the driveway and turned right onto our quiet residential street. Then I went to the kitchen, and I opened the cabinet where we kept the tea, and I took the small tin of chamomile out, the one Daniel had bought at the specialty store at the shopping mall, and I looked at it. I sniffed it. I tasted a single leaf on my tongue. It tasted like chamomile. I put it back. Then I went to Daniel's office, the small room off the den where he did the family taxes and paid the bills, and I started to look. Not for proof. I knew I would not find proof, not yet. I was looking for the thing a careful man hides when he thinks no one is looking. I was looking for the place he kept his secret. I found it in 45 minutes. It was not hidden cleverly. It was in the bottom drawer of his desk, in a manila envelope marked, in his own handwriting, Pharmacy Continuing. Education. Inside the envelope were 2 glass vials of a clear, slightly viscous liquid, each one labeled with a long pharmaceutical name I recognized immediately. Lorazepam. Concentrated solution. The kind of thing they keep in a locked cabinet in the back of a pharmacy. The kind of thing a pharmacist can sign out, 1 milliliter at a time, over the course of 2 years, without anyone noticing if he is careful. I did not take the vials. I did not photograph them. I did not move them. I put the envelope back exactly where I had found it, in exactly the same orientation, with exactly the same fold at the corner. And then I closed the drawer, and I went back to the kitchen, and I sat at the table for almost an hour, and I cried. Quietly. Without making a sound. Because for 26 years, I had loved a man who did not exist. When I had finished crying, I dried my eyes. I washed my face. I called my older sister Diane in the next state over, and I told her I was thinking about coming up for a weekend in July, just the 2 of us, to get away. She was thrilled. She said she would clear her calendar. I told her I loved her, and I hung up. Then I called a number I had found in the phone book the night before, a private medical laboratory in a city about 40 miles away that did toxicology screenings for divorce attorneys and private investigators. I asked them how much it cost to test a liquid sample. They told me $320 per panel, cash, no questions asked. I told them I would be there the following Monday. I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table. I made a list of every single thing I needed to do, in order, over the next 90 days, to put my husband in prison for the rest of his natural life. And then I burned the list in the kitchen sink and washed the ashes down the drain. Because I was a registered nurse, and I did not need to write it down. I had it memorized. The next Monday, the 8th of June, I drove 40 miles to that laboratory in the city. I brought with me a small mason jar containing the entire cup of tea Daniel had poured for me the night before, which I had hidden in the back of the refrigerator behind a container of leftover meatloaf. I paid in cash. I gave them a false name. The woman behind the counter, a tired-looking woman in her late 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, did not ask me a single question. She had seen women like me before. I drove home. I waited 3 days. On Thursday morning, while Daniel was at work, the laboratory called the burner phone I had bought at a discount store in the next town over. The results were exactly what I had known they would be. Lorazepam. Approximately 4 milligrams per cup. A dose 3 times the standard prescription, every single night, for at least 4 months. The technician on the phone, a young man with a soft voice, asked me if I was safe. I told him I was. I thanked him. I hung up the phone, and I drove to a storage facility outside town, and I rented a unit under my maiden name, Margaret Doyle, with cash, for 6 months in advance. The unit was 8 feet by 10 feet. It had a metal door and a single hanging light bulb. It was the most expensive thing I had ever bought without telling my husband, and it was the cheapest insurance policy I would ever own. That same afternoon, I drove to a different store, an office supply store across town, and I bought a leather-bound notebook. 200 pages. Lined. The kind of notebook a serious person uses to keep serious records. I bought a package of fine-tipped black pens. I bought a roll of clear packing tape. I drove home. I parked in the driveway. I sat in the car for 10 minutes, and I made myself a promise. I promised myself that no matter what happened over the next 90 days, no matter how tired I got, no matter how scared I got, no matter how many times my husband looked into my eyes and lied to me with that gentle, practiced kindness of his, I would write down everything. Every cup. Every word. Every look. Every small thing that happened in the kitchen of the colonial house on the quiet street between the night of the 3rd of June and whatever ending was waiting for me on the other side of it. I would build a case the way a registered nurse builds a chart. Date. Time. Symptoms. Observations. Notes. Because a chart, in the end, is just a story told well enough that it cannot be argued with. I bought 90 mason jars at the hardware store in 3 separate trips, 10 at a time, paying cash each time. I stored them in the storage unit, lined up on a metal shelf I assembled myself with a screwdriver and a set of instructions in Korean. I bought a small kitchen scale, the kind bakers use, accurate to the gram. I bought a roll of masking tape and a permanent marker. And on the evening of the 11th of June, 8 days after the second night I had poured the tea into a jar instead of drinking it, I sat across from my husband at the kitchen table, and I watched him stir the honey 3 times into my chamomile tea, and I smiled at him, and I drank exactly 1 sip in front of him to make the swallowing sound, and when he went upstairs to brush his teeth, I carried the cup quietly into the kitchen, opened the cabinet beneath the sink, pulled out a fresh mason jar from behind the cleaning supplies, set the jar inside the basin, poured the tea carefully into it, sealed the lid, labeled it Night 1, June 11th, and hid it behind the cleaning supplies once more. The next morning, I drove it to the storage unit before my shift at the hospital. I placed it on the shelf. I wrote in my leather-bound notebook, Night 1. 11th of June. Subject appeared relaxed. No deviation in ritual. 3 stirs. Same 6 words. I closed the notebook. I drove to work. I worked a 12-hour shift on the cardiac floor. I came home. I sat with my husband. I drank the smallest possible sip of tea in front of him. I poured the rest into a jar. The next morning, I drove it to the storage unit, and I wrote, Night 2. 12th of June. And that was how the 90 nights began. I want you to understand something about what those 90 nights were. They were not, the way some people imagined afterward, a long uninterrupted nightmare. They were, in their own strange and terrible way, almost peaceful. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner. I sat in my reading chair. I drank the smallest sip of the tea Daniel made me, just enough to make the swallowing sound he was listening for, and the moment he turned away or climbed the stairs, I poured the rest into a mason jar hidden beneath the sink and labeled it. I drove it to the storage unit the next morning before my shift. I wrote in my notebook. I lived inside my marriage and outside of it at the same time, the way a woman lives inside a house and outside a marriage when the marriage is over and the divorce papers have not yet been filed. I learned things about my husband I had not known in 26 years. I learned that he hummed when he thought no one was listening. I learned that he checked his phone exactly 4 times every hour on Saturdays. I learned that he had a small ritual of his own, a thing he did before he came into the bedroom at night, which was to stand in the bathroom for 90 seconds and look at himself in the mirror without moving. I do not know what he was thinking when he did that. I have my guesses. I do not think any of them are wrong. Around the 15th night, something began to shift in him. He had been giving me the lorazepam for almost 5 months by then, and he had grown accustomed to the way I was supposed to look in the mornings. The slowness. The fog. The bruise on my elbow from the laundry fall. The unsteadiness on the stairs. But now, because I was not actually drinking the tea, I was not slow in the mornings. I was sharp. I was rested. I was, for the first time since February, the woman I had been before. And I could see in his face, when he looked at me over the breakfast table, that this troubled him. He started asking me how I had slept. Not in the way a husband asks how a wife has slept, but in the way a doctor asks a patient. Did you sleep well, Maggie? Did you have any dreams? Did you wake up at any point in the night? I told him I had slept beautifully. I told him I had not had any dreams I could remember. I told him I felt better than I had in months, and I watched his face when I said it, and I saw something move behind his eyes that I had never seen there before. It looked like a man recalculating. On night 23, he changed the dose. I knew because I had the previous 22 cups in jars on a shelf at the storage unit, and the 23rd cup, when I drove it to the lab in the city the next morning, tested at 6 milligrams instead of 4. 50% more. He was increasing my dose because the symptoms had stopped, and he could not figure out why. I started writing in my notebook in a way I had not written before. Night 23. Dose increased. He knows something is wrong, but he does not know what. Night 24. Watching me more carefully. Asked me twice this morning if I felt all right. Night 25. Found him standing in the doorway of the kitchen this afternoon, looking at the cabinet under the sink. He has not opened that cabinet in 16 years. Night 26. He moved the vials. They are no longer in his desk drawer. I do not know where they are. I will find them. By night 35, Daniel was no longer sleeping. I know because I was. I was sleeping clearly for the first time in months, and he was the one staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning. He had begun lingering in the bathroom mirror longer than usual, as if searching his own face for reassurance. Small mistakes entered routines that had once been exact. He checked the cabinet beneath the sink more than once. He watched my hands when I lifted the cup. He asked too many questions about how I felt. He was not sick from anything I had done to him. He was unraveling under the weight of what he was doing to me. The longer I stayed sharp, the more his own calm began to fracture. He had built his plan on the assumption that I would never know. And now, in the small hours of the morning, in the bathroom mirror, in the kitchen doorway, he could feel that assumption beginning to come apart. On the 7th stair from the top, one night around night 39, Daniel suddenly lost his balance. He gripped the banister hard, cracked his shoulder against the wall, and sat there for almost a minute before forcing himself up. He did not call out to me. He did not want me to know. But I knew. I had been sitting in my reading chair, listening to the sound of his footsteps on the carpeted runner, and I had heard the exact moment his foot did not land where his mind had told it to land. For the first time in 26 years, uncertainty had entered my husband's body. Not because anything had been done to him. Because something inside him had begun to know that the careful architecture of his life was no longer holding. I want to be very clear about something, because I know there are people watching this video who will judge me for what I am about to tell you, and I want them to judge me honestly. I could have stopped at night 35. I had enough evidence by then to bury him. I had 35 jars of tea, each one labeled and sealed and stored in a unit under my maiden name. I had a notebook full of dates and observations. I had 3 lab reports. I had a private investigator I had hired, a retired sheriff's deputy named Walter Cosgrove out of the next town over, who had spent the last 3 weeks photographing my husband at a roadside hotel off the turnpike, where he met a 34-year-old dental hygienist named Brittany Mathers twice a month, always on Tuesdays. I had everything I needed to walk into the county sheriff's office and watch my husband be arrested before the end of the month. I did not do it. I did not do it because I knew that 35 nights of evidence was not enough. Daniel was a careful man. He had a clean record. He had character witnesses. He had a defense attorney's worth of money saved up in an account I had been added to in 2014 but never used. And I had not yet found out about Linda. I found out about Linda on the morning of the 18th of July. Night 46. I had driven down to the public library on the Main Street downtown, which is open at 9 in the morning on Saturdays, and I had asked the woman at the reference desk to help me find old newspaper archives from October of 2007. I told her I was doing some genealogy research for my niece. The woman was kind. She helped me find the microfiche. I sat at a small wooden corral in the back of the library for almost 2 hours, scrolling through the obituaries in an old regional newspaper archive, and I found her on the 3rd Tuesday of the month. Linda Marie Whitfield. 45 years old. Survived by her husband Daniel and her sister Carol Stenson. Linda had been an elementary school art teacher. Linda had loved gardening. Linda had been a member of a small Lutheran church on the north side of her city. Linda had died at home on a Sunday evening, of what the medical examiner had ruled a sudden cardiac event, with her husband Daniel, a pharmacist, performing CPR until the paramedics arrived. There had been no autopsy. The family had declined. I sat at that corral in the back of the library, and I looked at her picture in the obituary, a small black and white photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile and a haircut that had been popular in the late 1990s, and I thought about what Daniel had told me when we were first dating. He had told me his first wife had died of a heart attack at 45. He had told me it had been sudden, and it had been peaceful, and that he had held her hand at the end. He had told me he could not talk about it without crying, and so we did not talk about it. In 26 years of marriage, we had not talked about Linda more than 5 or 6 times. I had not pushed. I had thought I was being kind. I sat at that corral, and I realized I had been being something else. I had been being convenient. A woman who did not ask questions. A woman who would not, when the time came, look too closely at how her husband had handled his first wife's death. Because if I had looked, I would have seen it. And he had counted on me not looking. I drove home from the library. I made dinner. I drank my small sip of tea in front of Daniel, and I poured the rest into the jar that became night 46. I went to the storage unit the next morning. I wrote in my notebook, in handwriting that was steadier than my hands had any right to be, "Found Linda. Need to find Carol." I drove down to Carol's small town on the next Saturday, because I had looked up Carol Stenson in the white pages, and I had her address. I did not call ahead. I knew she would not answer if I called ahead. I drove to her house, a small ranch house on a quiet street with a maple tree in the front yard and a wreath on the door from the previous Christmas. I parked across the street. I sat in my car for 40 minutes. I watched a woman in her late 50s come out of the house with a watering can and water a row of petunias along the front walk. She had Linda's eyes. The same eyes from the obituary. I got out of my car. I walked across the street. I introduced myself. I told her my name was Maggie Whitfield, and I was married to her sister Linda's husband, and I needed to talk to her about something I could not say out loud on a stranger's front lawn. She did not invite me in. She told me to meet her the next Wednesday at a roadside restaurant off Interstate 71, halfway between her house and mine. She told me to come alone. She told me not to call her again until I got there. And then she went back inside her house, and I drove home, and I worked 3 12-hour shifts at the hospital, and on Wednesday morning at 9:30, I sat down across from Carol Stenson in a wooden booth in a roadside restaurant off Interstate 71, and a tired-looking waitress named Jolene refilled our coffee cups 3 times in the first hour without asking, because she could tell, the way a woman who has worked in a roadside restaurant for 20 years can tell, that the 2 women in Booth 14 were not having an ordinary conversation. Carol talked for an hour and a half. She told me Linda had been complaining of headaches and dizziness for almost 6 months before she died. She told me Linda had been forgetting things. She told me Linda had fallen twice in the last month of her life. She told me she had begged the medical examiner for an autopsy, and she had been told it was not necessary, because the husband was a pharmacist, and the husband had done CPR, and the symptoms were consistent with a cardiac event in a middle-aged woman with no family history. She told me she had begged the police to look into it, and they had told her, gently and kindly, that grief made people see things that were not there. She told me she had given up. She told me she had spent 18 years giving up. She told me she had not visited her sister's grave in 12 years because every time she stood at the headstone, she heard her sister's voice asking her why she had not fought harder, and she could not stand the sound of it anymore. Then she looked at me across the table, and she said, "What do you have, Maggie?" And I told her. All of it. The tea. The vials. The lab reports. The jars in the storage unit. The notebook. The roadside hotel. The insurance policy. And when I had finished, she reached across the table, and she took my hand, and she said the only 6 words that mattered. "I have been waiting for you." After that morning at the roadside restaurant, the last 45 nights moved differently. Carol and I were no longer alone with what we knew. We had each other. We met every other Saturday at the same booth at the same roadside restaurant off Interstate 71, and Jolene the waitress refilled our coffee cups without being asked, and we did the work 2 women do when the system has told them, for a combined 25 years, that nothing is wrong. Carol found Linda's old medical records. The ones from before she died. She found a prescription history that showed Linda had never, in her entire adult life, been prescribed a sedative. She found a journal Linda had kept, the last entry dated 3 days before her death, that said, I am so tired all the time, I do not understand why. Daniel says it is just stress. She found an old voicemail on her landline answering machine, which she had never erased, of Linda's voice from the September before she died, saying she was thinking about going to a different doctor, because Dr. Reynolds did not seem to be taking her seriously. On night 71, I made the call I had been avoiding for almost 2 months. I called Walter Cosgrove, the private investigator from the next town over, and I asked him to look into one specific thing. The insurance policy. I gave him the name of our insurance agent. I gave him the address of our colonial house on the quiet residential street. I told him I wanted to know if there was a life insurance policy in my name that I had not seen. He called me back the next afternoon. There was $2 million. Taken out 14 months earlier. Signed, ostensibly, by me. The signature, Walter said, was a good forgery, but it was a forgery. He could prove it. He had a handwriting analyst he had used for 15 years on civil cases, and the analyst would testify. I thanked Walter. I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table, in the same kitchen where my husband had stirred honey into my tea for 26 years, and I did not cry. I did not have anything left to cry about. I had moved past crying around night 55, somewhere on the drive home from Carol's small town, the second time Carol and I met. I was somewhere else now. I was somewhere quiet. On night 88, I called my sister Diane in the next state over, and I told her everything. The whole thing. From February forward. I told her the truth because I needed her to know it before the news did, and because she was going to need to be ready to take care of my 3 grown children when the story broke. Diane was quiet on the phone for a long time. And then she said, "Maggie, I am driving down there tonight." I told her no. I told her I needed 3 more days. I told her that on the morning of the 2nd of September, I was going to walk into the county sheriff's office with everything I had, and after that I was going to need her, very much, but until then I needed her to stay where she was and live her life and not call me, because Daniel had started watching my phone, and I could not risk a call from her that he would notice. She agreed. She made me promise to come straight to her house after the sheriff's office. I promised. I hung up the phone. I drank my small sip of tea. I poured the rest into the jar that became night 88. I drove to the storage unit. I placed it on the shelf. I went to bed beside my husband. And I slept, the way I had been sleeping for almost 3 months now, with my eyes wide open in the dark. On the morning of the 2nd of September, I made my husband his coffee the way he liked it. I kissed him goodbye at the front door. I told him I had a long shift at the hospital. And I would not be home until late. He told me he loved me. I told him I loved him too, and the strange thing, the thing I have thought about more than anything else in the year since, is that when I said it, I meant it. Not the way I had meant it for 26 years. I meant it the way you mean a thing about a person who has died. I loved who I had thought he was. I loved who he had pretended to be. I loved, in some small and complicated way, the 26 years he and I had spent inside the same house, even the years he had been planning what he was planning. And then I closed the door behind him. I watched his luxury sedan back out of the driveway. I went inside. I picked up the cardboard banker's box I had packed the night before. And I drove to the county sheriff's office, and I asked for the detective on duty, and a man named Frank Hollister came out to the front desk, and I said to him, "I think you should sit down." Daniel was arrested at 4:18 in the afternoon on the 2nd of September, behind the pharmacy counter at the local pharmacy where he had worked for 22 years. He did not resist. He did not say a word. He looked at the deputy who put the handcuffs on him with the same calm, patient expression he had looked at me with for 26 years, and he asked, in a voice the deputy would later describe in court as polite, whether he could call his attorney. The store manager, a young man named Trevor who had worked under Daniel for 6 years, told a reporter from the regional newspaper the next morning that customers in the aisles had stopped what they were doing and watched in complete silence. Nobody said a word. Nobody made a sound. A woman in the candy aisle, the reporter wrote, was holding a bag of peppermints, and she stood there frozen until the deputies had walked Daniel out the front door, and then she put the bag back on the shelf and left without buying anything. Linda's body was exhumed on the morning of the 23rd of September from the cemetery outside the city where she had been buried for almost 18 years. The toxicology was done at a state lab. The results came back 4 weeks later. Lorazepam. Levels consistent with chronic, long-term administration. The medical examiner who had ruled her death a sudden cardiac event in October of 2007 was now retired, living in Florida. He gave a statement to the prosecutor in which he said, simply, that with the technology and the toxicology screening that was available in 2007, the levels of the drug that had been in her system would not have been detected on a routine post-mortem panel. He did not apologize. He did not need to. Linda's sister Carol stood at the new headstone she had ordered for her sister's grave, the one that read, beneath Linda's name and the dates, finally heard, finally believed, and she did not cry either. Carol and I had moved past crying together, somewhere around the middle of November. The trial began on the 7th of March. It lasted 11 days. Daniel pleaded not guilty. His defense attorney, a man from the city with a $5,000 suit and a reputation for getting pharmacists out of trouble, argued that I was a mentally unstable woman who had planted the evidence, who had drugged my own tea, who had manufactured the entire case out of marital resentment over my husband's affair with the dental hygienist Brittany Mathers. The prosecutor put me on the stand on the 4th day of the trial. I testified for 6 hours. I brought my leather-bound notebook with me, and I read from it, in chronological order, every entry from night 1 to night 90. I described every mason jar. I described the storage unit outside town. I described the morning I drove to the laboratory in the city. I described the afternoon I sat across from Carol Stenson at a roadside restaurant off Interstate 71. I described the moment I found out about Linda. I did not cry on the stand. I did not raise my voice. I answered every question the defense attorney asked me with the exact level of detail he asked for and not one word more, because that was how I had been taught to chart, 30 years earlier, when I was a young nurse on the cardiac floor at the hospital. You answer the question. You write down what you saw. You do not editorialize. On the 8th day, the prosecutor asked me one final question. He asked me what my husband had said to me on our 25th anniversary, 2 years before he started giving me the tea. I told the court that he had stood up at the head of the table at the restaurant where we had eaten, with a glass of red wine in his hand, in front of our 3 grown children and my sister Diane and a dozen friends from the church, and he had said, to Margaret, the only woman I have ever loved, the only woman I ever will. The courtroom was silent. The jury foreman, a retired postal worker, was looking at Daniel. Daniel was looking at the table. The prosecutor sat down. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 20 minutes. They came back on the 11th day, in the late afternoon, and they found him guilty on every count. Attempted murder of Margaret Whitfield. First-degree murder of Linda Whitfield. Forgery. Insurance fraud. Theft of controlled substances from a licensed pharmacy. The judge sentenced him to life in a state correctional facility without the possibility of parole. I did not attend the sentencing. Carol did. She sat in the front row, alone, and she did not look at Daniel a single time. She told me later that she had not gone there to see him. She had gone there for Linda. 3 weeks after Daniel began serving his sentence at the state correctional facility, I received a letter at my new address, a small cottage I had rented in a town on the coast of Maine where the closest grocery store was 12 miles away. The letter had been forwarded from the county prosecutor's office. The return address was a small city in Florida. The letter was handwritten, on plain white stationery, in a careful slanted hand. The first line of the letter said, "My name is Rebecca Whitfield. I think I was married to your husband." I read that line 3 times before I read the rest. Then I sat down at the small kitchen table in the cottage, and I read the whole letter, and then I read it again. And then I picked up the phone, and I called Carol, who had moved into the cottage next door to mine in August, and I told her she needed to come over. Right now. Rebecca had been married to Daniel from the spring of 2009 until the autumn of 2010, which was the year and a half between Linda's death and the year Daniel met me. I had never known about her. Daniel had never mentioned her. The marriage had lasted 19 months. It had ended, Rebecca wrote, when she had begun waking up at 3 in the morning with a dry mouth and a racing heart, and when she had begun falling on the stairs, and when a friend of hers, a nurse named Donna, had taken one look at her in the spring of 2010 and told her, gently, that she needed to leave her husband immediately and that she needed to do it without telling him she was leaving. Rebecca had packed a suitcase one morning while Daniel was at work. She had driven to her mother's house in another state. She had never gone back. She had filed for divorce by mail. Daniel had not contested it. She had not heard from him again. She had never connected the dots. She had assumed, for 15 years, that she had simply been unlucky in her second marriage. She had read about my case in a national magazine that ran a long article on it in February. And she had sat in her kitchen for almost 4 weeks before she could bring herself to write the letter. Investigators in 3 states are now reopening cold cases involving women who knew Daniel Whitfield between 2007 and 2024. There may be others. We do not know yet how many. Carol and I have started a small foundation, registered out of the cottage I live in now, that helps women in long marriages find the resources to get out when they suspect something is wrong and the people around them have told them they are imagining it. We named the foundation after Linda. We did not ask anyone's permission. We do not need anyone's permission. Carol takes the morning calls, and I take the afternoon calls, and on Sundays we drive into town and we have lunch at a small diner on the water. And Jolene, the waitress from the roadside restaurant, sends us a Christmas card every year, and we are, in our own strange and unexpected way, happier than we have ever been. I want to end this with the cup. The blue porcelain cup with the chip on the rim, the one I had bought for Daniel on our 5th anniversary in a small ceramics shop downtown, the spring Hannah turned 3. I did not bring that cup with me when I moved to Maine. I did not throw it away either. I packed it in a small cardboard box, with a layer of tissue paper around it, and I put the box in the back of a closet in the colonial house on the quiet street, which I have not sold and do not intend to sell, because my 3 children grew up in that house, and one day my grandchildren may want to see it. The cup is still there. In the box. In the closet. With the chip turned, the way Daniel always turned it, away from the sight a person would drink from. I drink my tea now, in the mornings, out of a different cup entirely. A plain white mug from the hardware store in town. No chip. No pattern. No history. I make it myself. I stir the honey once, because once is enough, and I sit at the small kitchen table in the cottage, and I look out the window at the gray water of the bay, and I think, sometimes, about the woman I was on the 2nd of June of last year, sitting in a reading chair in a colonial house, holding a cup of tea in her hands and realizing, in the space of a single breath, that the man she had loved for 26 years had been quietly trying to kill her. I do not think about her with pity. I think about her with respect. She did not call the police. She did not pack a suitcase. She did not cry herself to sleep. She did not poison him back. She poured her tea into a mason jar. She labeled it. She hid it beneath the sink. And she began, that night, the slow and patient work of becoming the woman she actually was. If you are watching this, and you have a feeling, deep down where a wife keeps the things she cannot prove, that something is wrong in your own life, I want you to know that the feeling is not nothing. The feeling is the most important piece of information you will ever have. You do not have to act on it tonight. You do not have to act on it tomorrow. But you should write it down, in your own handwriting, in a notebook you keep somewhere only you know about, and you should pay attention to what you write, and you should trust yourself the way I learned, eventually, to trust myself. The truth does not need a loud voice. It does not need a dramatic confrontation. It does not need a confession. The truth only needs a steady hand, a patient mind, and a woman who has decided, finally, after a long time of not deciding, that she is going to live. Important legal and fiction disclaimer. This story is a fictional psychological crime narrative created solely for cinematic storytelling, dramatic entertainment, artistic expression, and fictional audiovisual presentation purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, businesses, hospitals, pharmacies, churches, organizations, institutions, law enforcement agencies, media outlets, correctional facilities, locations, events, or real criminal cases is entirely coincidental and unintended. Names, characters, timelines, occupations, relationships, locations, dialogue, and identifying details have been fictionalized, generalized, modified, or altered for narrative purposes. This work is not presented as factual journalism, documentary reporting, investigative reporting, legal accusation, evidence, or verified true crime reporting. No real person, business, institution, organization, church, hospital, pharmacy, law enforcement agency, or entity is being accused of criminal conduct, wrongdoing, negligence, or misconduct. This fictional narrative is protected expressive storytelling content intended solely for entertainment, commentary, and artistic presentation.